Good morning, everybody. The Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture will now come to order. The hearing this morning of the Subcommittee is the State of Beef Supply Chain, Shocks and Recovery and Rebuilding. And we've got four, I think, very good witnesses that will, I think, shed some light on the challenges we're facing across the country as a result of a multitude of factors. First, let me commend members of the subcommittee here today and give you a shout out for those who are here in person and those who are not to deal with the safety issue and set good examples by wearing our masks. It's something that none of us really care to do, but because of good public health safety, it's something that we should do. And for the safety of our staff and fellow members, I want to thank those of you. It's required in this hearing room per the guidance of the attending physician that was issued yesterday. And it's just a frustrating thing for all of us that this new variant has raised a new level of outbreak among those primarily who are unvaccinated. And so it's a hope and a prayer that I urge all of our American citizens to please get vaccinated. It's the right thing to do for yourselves and for your family and for our nation. It's just, you know, as kids we get vaccinated because we want to, you know, that's not the subject of this hearing, but I remind people in my district all the time, and it's a good thing to remind all of us. So this is a hybrid hearing. Proceedings allowed, obviously, for folks to participate as they are from their offices. And thank you all for being engaged this morning. For members of the committee, as you probably heard, we're going to have votes at 11 o'clock. So Dusty and I, the ranking member, we're going to try to figure out how to finesse it. When the votes are called, I'm told there are 3 votes, and so that's about an hour. So I want to still try to get our work done, but I'd like to make sure at least that we have our witnesses all give their testimony before the votes are called, and then we'll figure out what works best, whether we try to keep the hearing going and people alternately go and vote and then come back, or whether we just adjourn. But I want to get through this so that everybody's got busy schedules. Some of us have multiple hearings that are going on right now. I've got a Foreign Relations Committee markup at 10 o'clock that I'm going to try to vote on. And so we're all busy, and I'm very sensitive to your efforts to try to meet all your demands today as I'm trying to meet mine. So with that housekeeping efforts, I think, done. Let me begin the hearing in earnest. Obviously, as a result of the last 15, 16 months, we've learned, I hope we've learned some lessons. One of them that I think I share with all the members of this subcommittee is that because of the pandemic, as a result of closing schools and closing restaurants, we last spring learned that this complex, complicated food supply chain that we have in our country was virtually turned upside down. And bottlenecks ended up taking place in ways that we could never have imagined. Therefore, I think is incumbent upon us in the subcommittee to really examine what took place in this last year, because I think we all believe that food is a national security issue. We don't tend to look at it that way, but I try to remind folks that less than 5% of America's population every day works so hard at all the levels of food production to put food on America's dinner table. And we do it so well, in some ways, I think, that people take it for granted. You know, a lot of people think their food comes from the grocery store or their favorite restaurant. And we know, of course, I mean, they may get it at, well, most of them get it at the grocery store, their favorite restaurant, but it doesn't come from there. And so therefore, I think we've learned that we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable in a number of different ways. And the purpose of today's hearing is really to look at that, to look at the impacts. Let me give you, as we like to say, all politics are local. But my own situation in California, in 2019, the cattle and calves industry in my state were valued over $3 billion, placing them in the top 4 valued commodities in California. So obviously, like all of you, I have an interest in making sure that our ranchers, producers, our cattlemen and women have resiliency as it relates to the ability to deal with supply chains, fair markets in which they are able to put that food on America's dinner table. Over the past several years, the livestock industry has been subject to three notable shocks, each which has illuminated various vulnerabilities in the supply chain and has created instability in the marketplace. And that's really going to be our discussion today. The fire at one of the country's largest beef processing plants in Holcomb, Kansas in 2019 was the first event. That 4-month closure of this large plant created significant reduction in processing capacity, which led to a drop-off in fed cattle prices. The market's just been very volatile in the last couple of years. The next event I mentioned already was the COVID-19 pandemic. As we're all aware, the pandemic had enormous impact in every segment of America's economy, and the beef supply chain was not spared. Anyone who tried to buy ground beef or a steak at a grocery store during the first few months of the pandemic experienced a bottleneck in the supply chain firsthand. At the farm gate, producers were dealing with oversupply and, as I noted a moment ago, incredible volatility in prices. That's not good. President Biden and his administration, I just think, deserve great credit for their hard work over the last 6 months to help America get back on our feet. But I also want to give credit to all of the members here last year who helped us pass multiple COVID relief packages. The most recent one, of course, is the American Rescue Plan, which has provided relief to our farmers, ranchers, as they continue to rebuild, and Secretary Vilsack and his team are, I know, working overtime to implement this relief. The third shock that I think we've got to look in depth, and we're not going to solve that problem this morning, but we have some witnesses who can certainly add some value as to what we might think about doing, is cyber attack. Cyber attack on JBS over Memorial Day weekend. Cyber attacks like this will only increase. Their potential effect on our food and agricultural system cannot be ignored, just as they cannot be ignored as their potential impacts on our electrical grid, on our financial systems, and every other aspect of American life, because in the 21st century, we're all connected. And that provides a lot of benefits and efficiencies, but it provides a lot of vulnerabilities. And our food supply chain, we've learned the hard way about the potential vulnerability to cyber attacks. So we cannot allow food security, which is national security, and the protecting of our food system from foreign interferences to be disrupted. And it's something that I want to work with all of you in terms of thoughts on how we protect our vulnerabilities from cyber attacks. So it's our job on the subcommittee to get to the bottom of many of the complex challenges confronting agriculture and help our farmers, ranchers, dairymen, and women overcome these challenges. Today we will hear from 4 very good witnesses. I hope you've had a chance to read their testimony, who will tell us where they think the vulnerabilities in our food supply chain lie and their innovative ideas for helping the beef supply chain adapt, and to become more resilient so that we can use what we've learned over these 3 factors that have impacted us over the last 2 years and create some positive change. Now, my subcommittee staff, who makes me look good in spite of myself, will probably be upset that I didn't fail to read the earlier part of the briefing, but I will read it now. Obviously, after brief opening remarks, members will receive testimony from our witnesses, and then we'll follow the normal process where the ranking member will make his thoughts heard, and then we'll be recognized in the order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. And when you're recognized, you all know the rules. You got 5 minutes, and we try to be sensitive to everybody's time. If you're in the middle of a question being responded to, I will not interrupt the response to the answer to your question. But also, I am not a wild fan of people spending 4.5 minutes making a statement and then asking the question. I've been chairing hearings for a long time, so just a, little thing I got. Anyway, so if you're not speaking, remain muted, because we got this virtual hearing that we're dealing with, and it's difficult, it's challenging. And for those members who are, because of other conflicting obligations, working out of your office, may I remind you what I try to remind myself, with my staff reminds me, and that is, when you're not speaking, please press the mute button. I know sometimes you're multitasking, but I don't think the rest of us need to hear some of the other efforts that you're multitasking on. So please mute your microphone if you're not dealing with your 5 minutes. Anyway, the timer, I'm told, because of our good staff, will remain visible, right? Okay. So, in consultation with the ranking member pursuant to Rule 11E, I want to make the members of the committee aware that members of the full committee may join us today. Those are the magic words. She was wondering whether I was going to say that or not. I've said that. So, I think we're all there, and I will defer to my friend, the ranking member, for his opening statement, because I do not see the chair or the ranking member of the full committee here, so we're going to go on. Dusty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I will start with 2 notes of gratitude. The first is to you. When Congress focuses in a bipartisan way on issues, good things happen. And this panel, these witnesses, this is going to be a good thing. Thank you. And then I also just want to note my gratitude to other members of this subcommittee. I mean, when I think about the number of conversations, earnest conversations, honest conversations I have had on these topics with Jim Costo or Randy Feenstra or Tracy Mann or Jim Baird or Don Bacon or Vicki Hartzler or anybody who's on Zoom, it's amazing. I mean, I think the American people should feel good that their members of Congress really do care about these issues in an emotional way, but also in a data-driven way. Because for those of us who represent ranchers or backgrounders or stockers or feeders, we know how emotional and how unpredictable the last couple of years have been. Mr. Chairman, you noted it right. Black swan event after black swan event, and it has made it really hard for the people who try to feed America. And I think even the urban folks have seen how critically important, but also how fragile these supply chains are. You're right, Mr. Chairman. Food is a national security issue, and it is something that all Americans probably should pay more attention to than they do. I thought in the wake of COVID, or during the middle of COVID, we did some really good bipartisan work. 140 members of Congress stepped up in a bipartisan way to work with the administration to make sure that CFAP was rolled out to the people in the cattle industry who absolutely needed that assistance. And I think as we move past, hopefully, COVID, we'll understand that that was extremely important relief, but it was temporary relief for an extraordinary time. And the market deficiencies that were laid bare during that time aren't just going away. So we need to focus on from triage to long-term recovery. The cattle markets and processing are incredibly complex industries. They are all trying to respond to market signals. Some of our presenters today will talk about how they try to find, they're always seeking but never finding equilibrium, that balance to make sure that the number of head of cattle match the processing capacity, match consumer demand, and vice versa. Every step along that way is fraught with complexity. And I think one thing that we're all going to hear loud and clear in the testimony today is that we don't have enough processing capacity. And that is a market failure that has negative impacts both to consumers who want to eat the beef as well as producers who are trying to raise it. And we need to figure out how to increase that capacity. The lack of capacity has hindered the American rancher's ability to reap some of the benefits of an increasing demand and increasing appetite for beef across the world. As I move toward my close, though, I don't want to be so negative, because I think we understand that with challenging times comes opportunities. And since the pandemic, we have seen a tremendous amount of action to increase and to diversify our processing capacity. I'm glad to see that the bill that I had with Congresswoman Angie Craig that leveled the playing field for small processors when they run overtime and need federal inspectors. I was glad to see that that passed, and I'm glad to see that that's being rolled out. I'm also pleased with the announcements that $500 million is going to be available to increase resiliency in the processing sector. My goodness, how much we need that resiliency. And my hope, and the hope of a number of people on this subcommittee, is that we can allocate those funds in a way that promotes producer and cooperative ownership, that leverages funding to focus on enhancing processing capacity and on lowering cost to entry for that diversified processing ownership. I also want to call out the role of the private sector, because obviously that's the biggest piece of this puzzle. And we've got a number of new independent processors that have announced plans to build facilities. And to the extent that this committee can remain focused on reducing those barriers to entry, so many regulatory hurdles, so many capital hurdles, so many workforce hurdles, to the extent that we can stay focused on reducing those barriers to entry, we are going to have a healthier marketplace. American ranchers, I'll close, Mr. Chairman, by noting what we all know, that American ranchers have worked for generations, to improve quality and efficiency so they can feed their fellow Americans and people all across this globe. And if we do it right, we're going to be in a position to help them continue that glorious and that sacred mission for generations more to come. And if that isn't work worth doing, I don't know what is. And with that, I would yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and as I've indicated, that any members who wish to have a statement, we can submit that for the record. And let's get on to our witnesses here. And so we can begin their testimony, and it's a busy day today and tomorrow, and so we got a lot of things going on. But I'm pleased to welcome a very distinguished panel that our staff were able to put together here for this important hearing. They have a wide range of experience and expertise. So our first witness today, and I don't know what box they're in on this virtual here, is Dr. Jason Lusk. I think we all lament that hopefully we get knocked down this pandemic, but I like to have the witnesses here. I like to talk to them before the hearing starts and get a chance to interact. But Dr. Lusk is a distinguished professor and head of the Agriculture Economics Department of Purdue University. Lusk is a food and agriculture economist who studies what we eat and why we eat it. That's really the subject of a much longer conversation, I think. He has a Bachelor of Science in Food Technology from Texas Tech, a PhD in Agricultural Economics from Kansas State University, Purdue, Texas Tech, Kansas State, and has appointments to Mississippi State and Oklahoma State universities. Obviously, he made it a point of visiting many of the wonderful universities in this country. So let us begin with Dr. Lusk. Dr. Lusk, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you hear us?
I can.
Okay, please begin.
Chairman Costa, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. As indicated, my name is Jason Lusk. I currently serve as a distinguished professor and head of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. Beef and cattle markets have been extraordinarily volatile over the past couple of years. And when you're trying to understand the current challenges, I think some historical perspective is warranted. Over the past decade, cattle inventories have followed a V-shaped pattern. From 2010 to 2015, cattle slaughter fell by more than 16% as producers cut inventory in response to high feed prices and drought. The change in cattle numbers affected the packing sector. There was at that time too much packing capacity relative to the number of cattle, and some packers exited because it was no longer profitable. Following a common cyclical pattern, producers retained heifers and expanded their herds to capture the benefits of the higher prices that were experienced in 2014 and 15. But by 2019, total cattle slaughter had increased almost 17% relative to the 2015 low. The packing sector, having adjusted to a smaller herd size, now found itself in the opposite position. There was a high number of cattle relative to capacity, which put downward pressure on cattle prices. And it was against this backdrop that we experienced the unexpected fire, pandemic, and cyber attacks. There's a key lesson to take from this recent historical episode. There are long lags and ripple effects in cattle markets. My recommendation to you is don't overly focus on what is happening today, but make policies for the future. With that background, I'll briefly touch on 3 issues facing the industry. The first is capacity. As noted, processing capacity in 2020, even if the pandemic hadn't occurred, was likely to be tight. But today, we appear to be in a different phase of the cattle cycle. Cattle inventory is falling, feed prices have been rising, there's a drought in the West. These factors will likely bring cattle numbers closer in line with current capacity. Moreover, there are a number of private initiatives to increase automation and add more capacity. More capacity, fewer cattle will help support future cattle prices. Making additional government investments in capacity for the purpose, at least, of improving cattle prices may be fixing yesterday's problem. Support for small and local processors may benefit local economic ecosystems and may increase custom harvest operation for producers. But these operations, because they lack economies of scale, must focus on quality or service to be competitive. The costs of adding packing capacity are not limited to concrete and iron. I encourage you to consider other barriers that limit new entrants. These factors include labor availability and costs of complying with regulations related to labor, food safety, zoning, transportation, and more. The second issue relates to proposals to require a share of cattle be sold on a negotiated or cash basis as opposed to a formula or grid in an effort to improve price transparency. An important distinction needs to be made between price levels and price volatility. And even if all cattle were traded on a negotiated basis, the price level would not necessarily improve. Are there less costly ways to improve price discovery than a mandate? Livestock mandatory reporting, LMR, is one tool that has improved price transparency. Continued research into this legislation might further benefit the industry. Market maker programs that incentivize voluntary participation in cash markets is another tool. Even if a mandate were pursued, it might be made more efficient if coupled with a cap and trade system where obligations to secure cattle in a cash market might be bought and sold in a secondary offset market, similar to what currently exists for fuel manufacturers mandated to blend biofuels. Including negotiated grids and a mandate would also lessen the cost of such a policy. Finally, I encourage you to focus on policies that improve the health of the entire industry. Discussions of cattle prices and packing capacity can give the incorrect impression that beef and cattle markets are a zero-sum game. But consider policies that increase the size of the pie for all players. Examples include improving trade relations that allow products to flow to consumers who value them most, and investments in research and innovation that improve demand or improve productivity. In conclusion, my view is that the beef cattle system responded remarkably well to a series of large and unexpected disruptions. Cattle prices have been on the rise, consumer demand is strong, and these core facts should remain front of mind when considering policy changes because the cattle industry is constantly evolving and there's a need to remain competitive with other plant and animal-based proteins that have a place on the consumer's dinner plates.
Thank you very much for your insightful testimony. I think you're suggesting that we look at the long term as we deal with the challenges that we're facing in terms of the supply chain, and I know that there'll be questions based upon your very good testimony. So stay tuned because we all have questions. Our next witness today is Jennifer derLite, the Director of Integrated Food Systems Leadership Program, the Director of Food Protection and Defense Institute, and an associate professor of the University of Minnesota. A key focus of Dr. derLite's current research portfolio is building collaborations to advance food and feed security, safety, and defense, and supply chain resilience, which is all part of really this morning's subcommittee hearing. Dr. derLite completed her PhD in nutrition from the University of Kentucky, and what I'm noticing here is a trend. Our witnesses here today seem to have had very good education from a number of American universities, so good for all of you. Dr. derLite, would you please begin your testimony?
Thank you. Chairman Costa and Ranking Member Johnson, members of the Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. It is an honor to appear before you. I'm the director of the Food Protection and Defense Institute and associate professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. And as Chairman Costa indicated, I also have experience from Kentucky, University of Kentucky, as well as from the University of Illinois and North Carolina State University. So with the theme of representing the country and its fine educational institutions. Since 2004, the Food Protection and Defense Institute and Emeritus Homeland Security Center of Excellence has partnered with stakeholders across government, industry, and academia to protect the food system from disruption. Cyber risk, the focus of my testimony, is not new to the food and ag sector, but the risk of significant business disruption and national security threats from cyber attack are growing. An evolving cyber risk in the food and ag sector is the growing dependence upon cyber-based information and operational technology systems. These operational technology systems manage the most critical aspects of food production, typically have the lowest level of integrated cybersecurity protections, and are often omitted from enterprise cybersecurity plans, protections, and training. In response to the USDA request for public comments on supply chains for the production of agricultural commodities and food products, we recommended 5 specific actions for the USDA to take to improve cybersecurity within the national food and agriculture supply chains. These actions are outlined in my written testimony and require that USDA serve as the lead agency in collaboration with FDA, DHS, and FBI, with consultation of food and ag, insurance, and cybersecurity industry partners. So why should these actions be taken? The food and ag sector is incredibly diverse, from small businesses and family farms to multinational corporations that produce an infinite variety of foods. All of these businesses are individually vulnerable to cyber attack. On a broader scale, though, the food system is one of the most interconnected systems within the critical infrastructures. From a cyber perspective, this amplifies the attack surface and the risk. It also amplifies the potential magnitude of system disruption and failure from a cyber attack, including its secondary and tertiary cascading impacts. For example, the recent JBS cyber attack disrupted meat processing operations in several countries and simultaneously caused disruptions to supply chains, logistics, and transportation to customers, and it increased consumer prices. Additionally, the food and ag sector is labor intensive. A history of labor shortages coupled with technology advancements have driven automation in the sector. With increased automation and computational and network complexity, cyber risk also increases. Regardless of why cyber risk exists, cyber attacks in the food and ag sector have the potential to cause catastrophic supply chain disruption and can endanger our national security. As a hypothetical example of a national security threat, consider for a moment the impact if both of the only 2 HDPE pellet plants, those are the plants that produce the gallon milk jug preforms, were victims of a simultaneous cyber attack. This is not unrealistic. We do know that during Hurricane Katrina, when just one of these HDPE facilities was compromised, the supply of fluid milk at the consumer level plummeted to shortage levels in many areas of the country, while dairy farmers dumped millions of gallons of milk. A situation such as this could be repeated and affect a broad area of the nation in the event of a targeted cyber attack. It should also be recognized that the food and ag sector partners must balance a multitude of supply chain, food safety, labor, financial, and other operational risks, in addition to cyber risk. Not only does managing cyber risk increase operational costs, but there are very few experts with the knowledge and experience to effectively enhance cybersecurity in the food and ag operational environment. This type of expert is often recognized as irreplaceable and sometimes are referred to as unicorns within the food industry. We need to train and field many more of them. Securing the vast cyber infrastructure and electronic information systems sustaining America's food and ag supply system is vital to the economic vitality of the system and to our nutritional and national security. If we do not act, we risk the nation's ability to provide a sufficiency of nutrition, the very essence of well-being for our friends, family, colleagues, constituents, and institutions. We appreciate the opportunity to engage and contribute to this national discussion. I look forward to further discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Van Light, and we look forward to our opportunity to ask you about what sorts of private-public partnerships we can pursue to reinforce our vulnerabilities against cyber attacks, and that opportunity will come shortly. Our third witness today is Dr. Kerry Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs holds a MFA chair in agribusiness, is a graduate of the Institute of Cooperative Leadership Fellows, an associate professor of agriculture and applied economics at the University of Missouri, the Show Me State. Her research explores consolidation and catalysts and impacts among Midwest agricultural cooperatives and the benefits of increased supply chain participation by producers. Very appropriate for today's subcommittee hearing. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Economics, associate degree, Business Administration from Cole College, and a PhD in Economics from North Carolina State University. Again, enjoying the multitude of universities of this wonderful country of ours. Dr. Kerry Jacobs, please open on your witness this morning.
Thank you. Chairman Costa, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion regarding producer ownership in our beef supply chain. As an economist, I believe in the power and elegance of capitalism. The pursuit of profitability through private ownership, private control, and private returns fuels innovation and efficiency. My testimony today is not about the economics of the beef supply chain. However, through cooperation, pricing, information exchange, and other market dimensions can be improved and sustained. In 1922, in response to growing imbalances and tensions in ag, not unlike what we see and hear today, Congress authorized producers to form cooperatives, the laws known as the Capper-Volstead Act. In doing so, Congress provided a mechanism for producers to have equal footing with the big companies they purchased from and sold to. The requirements of Capper-Volstead are that the co-op be governed by its producer members, be capitalized by them, and that those producers share in the profitability of those business activities. Those requirements help co-ops bring discipline to markets. Instead of focusing on short-term profitability, the cooperative transfers the value from the upstream and downstream markets back to its producer members. The question this committee, the subcommittee, and the industry contemplates is whether producer ownership is a way forward for this industry. You have heard testimony of the significant scale economies that exist in beef processing.
Pardon me, could you repeat that one more time?
Yep. I started with the question the subcommittee and the industry contemplates is whether producer ownership is a way forward for the industry. You have heard testimony of the significant scale economies that exist in beef processing, suggesting that small scale processing to commodity markets is unlikely to be sustainable long term. Rather than working against scale economies, one option is to support livestock producer ownership to an efficient scale. We do have examples of large-scale producer ownership in pork. Triumph Foods is producer-owned, and its structure reflects the characteristics of cooperatives that discipline a market. The producers' owners have long-term contracts to sell hogs, and they effectively earn wholesale meat prices for their animals. Concentration in the livestock industry, particularly at the processing stage, seems inevitable from an efficiency lens. Through cooperation, however, livestock producers can flip the script and participate in generating and receiving the value this efficiency creates. Producer ownership in beef processing is possible, and it has the potential to improve conditions for beef producers in the entire supply chain. When at scale, producer ownership can smooth variability in producer incomes because it allows them to capture income from downstream markets that may be less volatile. More of the value-added income stays in the producers' rural communities and the cooperatives communities instead of flowing to investors. To accomplish this, livestock producers must coordinate and commit production via contracting. They likely need assistance in overcoming challenges such as selling byproducts from processing and addressing uniformity in feedstock supplies. I encourage Congress to consider the additional policies and actions that can improve the likelihood of an adoption and success of producer ownership in beef processing and the successes of livestock producers. Among these are investments in research to understand minimum efficient scale in beef processing and the producer commitment it will require, temporarily subsidizing evidence-based scalable capacity, creating a loan guarantee program that reduces risk to lenders to producer-owned beef finishing, and ensuring financing is available earlier in their investment period, preserving niche market products and investments through labeling laws, and finally, coordinating technical assistance for producers interested in forming cooperatives, helping them gain traction in the startup period, and helping them as they navigate market coordination with their downstream partners. I began my testimony by stating my belief in capitalism. Through my work with cooperatives and their producer members, I do appreciate the collective action model as a workhorse of capitalism in agriculture. Cooperation takes a holistic view of the agricultural supply chain. With temporary assistance and the appropriate policies, producers can work within the parameters of scale and benefit from it. Capitalism through cooperation by producers enables even the small producer to improve his or her economic situation. This form of capitalism can improve economic conditions in rural communities, and it pays attention to the whole of the supply chain. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to join the discussion. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs, for your, I think, very informative testimony, and we'll look forward to the Q&A portion. Our last witness, certainly not the least, is Dr. Dustin Hearn. Dr. Hearn is an animal protein analysis at Robo AgriFinance. I think many of us know that Robo AgriFinance has a great presence in providing lending activity throughout American agriculture, well-respected financial institution. Dr. Hearn within animal protein concentrates his work on beef. Hearn has a unique combination of commercial beef production experience and analytical training. He joined Robo Research after completing his PhD at the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University. And he also holds a bachelor's and master's degree in animal science from Kansas State. It looked like, Dr. Hearn, you've stayed in Kansas, but good for you, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Costa. Ranking Member Johnson and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to join the discussion today. As an animal protein analyst for Rabobank, which is engaged across the entire beef supply chain, I assist in strategic decision-making for both the bank and the bank's clients by offering a research-based perspective on fundamental market dynamics and future trends. Major U.S. beef supply chain disruptions over the past 2 years have sent the cattle and beef industry into uncharted but explainable territory. The imbalance of excess market-ready cattle supplies in the face of reduced operational packing capacity has put downward pressure on cattle prices. Meanwhile, consumer demand for beef and all animal proteins has reached record levels. These dynamics, combined with elevated processing costs, have increased the spread between beef price and cattle price, just as economic principles, past research, and historical relationships would suggest. Both the direction and magnitude of the price spread are well within the range of expectation. The pandemic has created enormous challenges for cattle producers. Seeing the price difference between cattle and beef has only added to the emotional strain. I understand the frustration. I've owned and bred cattle most of my life, and I have friends and family that make a living ranching and feeding cattle. However, with stakeholders that are invested throughout the entire supply chain from rancher to packer to retailer, I must look at the beef industry from an objective and analysis-based perspective. First, cattle are not beef. Cattle are one of several inputs into beef production. Other major inputs include labor, physical capital, and technology. These inputs are always seeking, but never finding the perfect balance. This creates cycles. Input imbalances are communicated through prices, whether that's cattle prices, wages, or investments. In recent years, extreme and unexpected events have severely restricted several of these inputs. Examples include facilities in the August 2019 plant fire and labor during the pandemic. A working market sends price signals to adjust. These same price signals created record high cattle prices and packer losses in 2014 and 2015. The biology of the beef industry makes it slow-moving and capital-intensive. Adjustments take years. While recent unforeseen events have exacerbated the situation, the foundation for today's circumstances was laid over several decades. Beef packing has historically been a low-margin business. In the year 2000, the U.S. harvested nearly 30 million head of fed cattle. By 2015, fed cattle slaughter was under 23 million head. Throughout this period of cattle supply contraction, the most inefficient packing plants were driven out of business as competition for limited cattle supplies drove cattle prices to record highs. From 2000 to 2015, the U.S. beef industry experienced a net decline of roughly 14,000 head per day in fed cattle processing capacity. Even before the extremes of 2020, recent margins suggest opportunity to add operational packing capacity. However, that opportunity comes with significant risk. Based on recent new plant announcements and the current environment of high construction costs, a new plant currently costs roughly $200 million for every 1,000 head of daily capacity. Then, a new endeavor must meet regulatory requirements, build a labor force, and keep enough cash on hand to absorb losses. Most crucially, it's not just about building facilities, it's about building a business model. To compete against the efficiency of large incumbent packers, new entrants will likely have to build a differentiated premium brand strategy. Differentiated beef requires differentiated cattle. Alternative marketing agreements are the best way to secure a consistent supply of such differentiated cattle. Strong vertical supply chain relationships will be critical to the success of any new beef business. In response to market signals, numerous plans for greenfield plants or expansions of existing facilities have been unveiled in recent months. If all of the announced plans for plant construction and expansion come to fruition, more than 8,000 head of daily fed cattle capacity could be added to the U.S. beef industry over the next 5 years. Recognizing current drought conditions, if the beef cow herd declines by 2% or less, there's opportunity for about 5,000 head per day of profitable packing expansion. A note of caution, there is a point where industry capacity goes too far to withstand cyclical periods of tight cattle supplies. Drought risks and cyclical fundamentals must be considered. Additional operational capacity does not solely have to come from new facilities. Increased technology implementation will be critical to success. Recently, many packers have revitalized their focus on technology development. Enlightened by the pandemic to the long-standing labor shortages in the meat industry, startups are also bringing outside expertise to advance technology and automation. 1% improvement in volume efficiency across all existing plants would add 1,000 head of daily fed cattle processing capacity. 2020's cattle backlog is nearly cleared. Year-over-year cattle prices are already improving and should continue to do so through the second half of 2021 and beyond. In conjunction with tightening cattle supplies, capacity expansion will come online over the next several years, and new technologies will reduce labor constraints, further shifting margins to the benefit of cattle producers. In closing, the recent shocks to the beef industry have presented the entire beef supply chain with enormous challenges. The resulting price movements have been frustrating for cattle producers, to say the least. Yet these same price movements and supply chain disruptions have also contributed to the accelerated investment in packing capacity expansion, new technologies, and new business strategies that will help the beef industry adapt and evolve to ever-changing demand. And that's the market at work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hearn. And basically what you're saying is what has always, I think, proven true, and that is necessity is the mother of invention, and that in terms of the changes that have occurred in the food supply chain, the necessity of the combination of factors that we've outlined this morning have resulted in innovation and changes within the beef cattle market industry. All good testimony, folks, and now we'll get to the opportunity for members to ask questions in your allotted time. And I conferred with the ranking member here. It's the chair's wish, if we can make it work, and we'll try to make it work, that when votes are called, that we'll continue to go and people go and come back. We have 3 votes supposedly. The list that I have here among members who wish to speak and ask questions on the Democratic side, Axney, Rush, Craig, Hayes, and Spamberger. On the Republican side, DeJarden, Kelly, Bacon, Baird, Mann, Feenstra, Moore, Hartzler, and Rouser, and possibly LaMaffa, who is, I think, participating. That's the list I have, if it's in the order that it's been given to me. So with that said, let me begin my questions. Dr. Lusk, as you know, we've had in the West drought-stricken challenges that we've been faced with. Ranchers and farmers, dairy men and women have been impacted by these droughts. 85% of the respondents rated selling off portions of their herd or flocks as prevalent or higher in their area. Can you talk about how the extreme drought has impacted, along with wildfires, western United States, including California, that we're experiencing right now, and how it might impact the beef supply chain and cattle markets?
Sure. I think for those folks that are experiencing drought, it's an extraordinarily difficult position, and it's one of the factors that leads to these cycles that I think I alluded to, also Dustin, I believe, alluded to as well, that some of that liquidation that's happening now is going to have repercussions 3 or 4 years from now. Unfortunately, in some cases, bad news for people in the West is good news for people in other parts of the country, because that'll eventually lead to some higher prices as there are fewer supplies on the market, fewer cattle on the market will support future prices. So, I think it's a very difficult time. It does suggest the need, I think, to protect against, weather-related risk and price-related risk. And I think there are a number of tools available to producers to help at least protect somewhat against those adverse situations. I think it also speaks to the need to understand some of the impacts of climate change on the industry and think about research and technology science that can be used to help producers adapt to and be more resilient in the face of some of these changing weather conditions.
Thank you. Members, I initiated a letter that many of you signed to Secretary Vilsack that urged the USDA to take a stronger role in helping food and agricultural industry bolster their cybersecurity and better respond to cyber attacks. Dr. Van Light, I'd like you to comment. In your testimony, you referenced an alphabet soup of government agencies and some tied to cybersecurity. Can you comment on how the interagency is working together or should be working together? Too often, I think we operate in silos that really aren't helpful. To ensure that our federal government as a whole, as well as the industry, are better prepared to fight cyber attacks as a whole. And I'd like your comments on the recent efforts that we've experienced on the payoffs on ransomware and whether or not that should be encouraged or discouraged, and your thoughts on that. Dr. Van Light.
Great, thank you. A couple questions there. Within the food sector, the alphabet soup of agencies, USDA, FDA, DHS, FBI, they all play a role. Part of that is because the way that food is...
Are they talking to each other?
I am. Can you hear me?
No, I said, are these alphabet of federal agencies talking to each other? I know you're talking to us.
Oh, sorry. They do, Chairman Costa. So there is a Food and Agriculture Critical Infrastructure Government Coordinating and Sector Coordinating Council. And so there is communication at that level. They do talk, but there are still some inefficiencies in that. One of the reasons that we recommended that USDA take the lead, particularly with cybersecurity, is because they have more influence across the broader set of agriculture, particularly pre-harvest. But it's really important that they continue this collaboration and this communication. DHS and FBI are two interesting ones that come in. DHS, from a national security perspective, as you alluded earlier, food supply is actually a national security issue. And so they bring a different influence and a different view to the table. And FBI, particularly in the cybercrime arena, is really important. But we also can't forget our private sector partners, because they're the ones that are going to be doing much of the work. And so this collaboration and this communication through, and I think we can begin it and continue to implement it through the GCC and SEC. But we should also take into account the congressional actions that have already taken place. So for example, the Food Safety and Modernization Act actually has an infrastructure, a legal infrastructure in order to, that could be leveraged to move cyber defense forward in the food industry under the auspices of how it impacts food safety and things like traceability.
Well, we'd like your recommendations. My time's expiring here, I apologize, but your view on ransomware.
That's where I was going, on ransomware. Ransomware is really the nemesis right now. And, you know, as publicity increases and more people are paying off ransomware attackers, you know, it becomes more lucrative for them to be able to do that. And that it particularly is true in the realm of cryptocurrencies. So I think we'll see a rise in ransomware. However, we're also finding that there's a way to pull back. I think, like in the case of JBS, through our FBI and our federal partners, they were able to pull back some of that payment. So that offsets it. But publicity and money, it drives a lot of evildoers in this in the society. And so I do think we can continue to see it, cyber attacks continue to perpetrate themselves.
Okay, well, my time's expired, but this is something I want to pursue further in terms of the appropriate role in which we can protect the private sector, because I think this is going to continue until we, whether it's through the NSA or FBI or other means of the federal government, to provide this protection because of the factors that are involved. My friend, the ranking member, it's your opportunity to ask questions or make comments.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Ahern, I'll start with you. I thought your addendum to your testimony was very interesting insofar as it talked about, it showed how high packer margin had been in the last 3 or 4 years, and then how modest it was in maybe the 10 or 15 years prior to that. We've heard some discussion today about an extra 5,000 head of capacity likely coming online. What would be, maybe in just 1 minute, what would be the impact on packer margin if that new capacity does show up?
So all else equal, expanding packing capacity would likely reduce packer margins because it's going to increase competition for cattle, which will drive up cattle prices. And I think it's important to remember that packers are margin operators. So the money that they make is the difference between beef price and cattle price and the cost that they incur to turn those cattle into beef.
And we've seen futures trend up. Is the market baking in some of these assumptions about capacity expansion?
In terms of futures, I think the primary driver, at least in current contracts, is tightening cattle supplies. We've largely worked through the 1 million head backlog that was created in the second quarter of 2020 when all those plants were shut down or slowed down. And we are going through extreme drought situations in much of the country. The cow herd is in a contractionary phase. So a lot of these plants that are being built, if they're successful, won't come online for a number of years. So I think the most immediate price moves are due largely to cattle supplies.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, about the short term versus the long term. So, I'd be interested in getting the take on this next question from Dr. Ahern, Dr. Lusk, Dr. Jacobs, if we have time. Dr. Lusk, I was struck by your point. I'll put some words in your mouth, but basically that just expanding capacity, maybe in a dumb way, might create another set of bankruptcies or acquisitions on the capacity side. I think we do, to the extent that we do anything, I think we do want it done in a smart way and in a way that will create some abiding and some sustainable benefits. So Drs. Ahern, Lusk, Jacobs, how do we try to make sure that these policy interventions are done in a helpful, long-term, beneficial way?
I think from my perspective, the best case for expanding capacity is really the one related to the resiliency issue. In my view, resiliency is not necessarily related to the size or the location. The problem we had during the pandemic was just there wasn't enough space for all these cattle to go. And the problem is it's in no individual packer's capacity to have excess capacity that they're not currently utilizing. I don't think there are really any easy answers to that problem. But if you want excess to capacity to exist in the system, somebody's got to pay for it at the end of the day.
Dr. Jacobs, not to put words in your mouth, but I think the whole point of your testimony is that cooperative ownership could provide a way to invest in a way that you would think would be more sustainable and abiding. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, that's right. And, I think there's a lot of benefits to a supply chain from cooperation, and producers have the ultimate incentive to ensure the sustainability, the security of their supply chains, their livelihoods depend on it. I do want to say, though, however, that the margins have to be there. A cooperative model is not affixed to a market, to a business model that's not profitable, the part of the supply chain that's not profitable. So that has to be there. And that's why I was suggesting that there needs to be investment to help understand what the minimum efficient scale is so that there can be margins at producer ownership and processing, and help in scaling up to that.
Thank you. Dr. Ahern, the last minute is yours.
So one thing I think we really need to focus on is it's not just about facilities. We have to be able to meet consumer demands in a cost-effective manner. And simply trying to replicate commodity cattle processing facilities, beef processing facilities for some of these smaller initiatives really is probably not destined for success. So I think really investing in research and market research and business model development, understanding consumers, and how do we get the cattle that we need to meet that product differentiation. I think that's where a lot of the focus needs to be.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and the next member to be recognized is Congressmember Craig from Minnesota. Congressmember, are you on there? I see you.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Chairman Costa, and thank you to Ranking Member Johnson as well for calling this hearing to focus on the beef supply chain and the overall security of our food supply chain. Given the consolidation in the beef packing and meat processing industry and the events of this past year, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the increasingly common cyber attacks targeting U.S. industries, today's conversation is especially relevant. Thank you also to those who have testified today. I appreciate the input you shared with us, and I'm especially grateful for your work to tackle these incredible challenges we have before us. During the most recent meeting of my bipartisan Farmer Advisory Council, the issue of processing capacity and supply chain stability came up over and over. Producers in my district have struggled to get their product to market due to the facility closures during the pandemic and other unexpected events like the JBS attack. Unfortunately, we don't know when the next cyber attack or black swan event is coming, and farmers and ranchers in my district need these supply chain issues addressed immediately. With that perspective in mind, I want to ask a question both to Dr. Hearn and a question to Dr. derLite. First, Dr. Hearn, thank you for your testimony and your mention of how additional processing capacity can come from new facilities and also from expansion and increased investment in existing facilities. Can you talk a little more about the challenges that existing facilities face when seeking to expand their operations, and what steps could be helpful in addressing those challenges?
Certainly. One of the biggest challenges facing existing operations is labor and meeting the labor needs. A facility doesn't do any good if we don't have the labor or the technology to put product through that facility. I think one area that really deserves a lot of attention is technology and automation, and trying to work smarter, not harder, in terms of getting beef product through these facilities and relieving some of these labor challenges. So a key point I want to make is that when I talk about processing capacity, I'm really focusing on operational capacity. So not the physical size of a facility, but what's our throughput. And you can increase throughput in a number of ways, and one of those ways is more efficient production through technology.
Incredibly important. Thank you. I now want to turn to Dr. derLite. Thank you for your leadership on food system security at the University of Minnesota. Your testimony on the current state of cyber resilience in the food supply chain makes incredibly clear that we have a long way to go in ensuring immunity from sophisticated attacks on operating technology systems. Your recommendations are incredibly helpful. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on what companies are doing in light of the JBS cyber attack to improve their cybersecurity systems. What can Congress do to ensure those efforts are thorough and successful?
Thank you, Congressman Craig. So the private sector obviously takes these risks very, very seriously. Anytime that they are down with a cyber attack, they're losing money. So there's an economic incentive to prepare. What is difficult is that many of our private sector partners don't really embrace or fully understand the difference between informational technology, so email, data records, payroll, things like that, versus their operational technology. So one of the things that can be done is working with this collaborative partnership of government agencies to really take some of the cybersecurity best practices that are prevalent in other critical infrastructures and adapting them so that they're fluent across both the informational and the operational technologies within that are specific in the food and ag infrastructure. And then the other thing is Congress could encourage our regulatory agencies to take full advantage of the Food Safety Modernization Act to use the strength of that law to create an equal playing field and a requirement that cybersecurity be an essential component in their food safety plans, because these cyber attacks, they don't just have the opportunity to cause a company to cease business. They also have the capability of putting unsafe food in the market. So the regulatory and the legal structure already exists. It's just encouragement to take advantage of that.
Thank you so much, Dr. derLite. And I think with that, my time has expired and I will yield back.
We thank the gentlewoman from Minnesota, and the next member in order is Mr. derLite from Tennessee. Mr. derLite, it appears that you're at your office. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Costa. I appreciate that. Tennessee is a large producer of cattle. It ranks about 12th in the nation. And cattle and calf receipts rank number 2 in the state for total farm cash receipts. So this is an important issue to us, as it is in many states. We're blessed to have the largest farm bureau in the nation in my district in Columbia, Tennessee. And so we're so glad you're all here today to help us sort through these tough issues. Dr. Hearn, Tennessee farmers want to know that they are receiving a fair price for their cattle. How can Congress help increase transparency into this cattle market while also ensuring that today's solutions do not inhibit tomorrow's progress?
So from a transparency perspective, I think we need to recognize that mandatory price reporting really does a lot already. I think there are certainly some places where we can investigate expanding some of that price reporting as we reauthorize LMR moving forward. I think a couple areas could be reporting some base prices on formula transactions. I also think it's worth noting that in a lot of ways, the formula pricing bucket is kind of a catch-all, and it's become a very large portion of transactions at the fed cattle level. So there may be some opportunity to disaggregate that a little bit without getting into too many confidentiality challenges.
Okay, well, following up with that, what are the positives for farmers?
Another area that I think is worth exploring is price reporting.
Okay, I'm sorry. What are the positives for farmers and feedlots to enter in various contracts like Formula Grid Future with the packers rather than just selling cattle through negotiated trade?
So alternative marketing agreements, which are agreements that occur outside of the spot cash market, they really help to minimize supply chain risks, reduce marketing costs, increase capacity utilization, both at the feedlot level and the packer level. So really what this does is it reduces operational costs and operational risks, which in turn filters down to being able to pay higher prices for cattle as it goes back to the cow-calf sector.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. And my last question is for Dr. Lusk. Labor recruitment and retention is a chief concern shared by meat producers of all sizes. How do labor shortages at meat plants impact cattle producers? And in your view, can Congress do anything to aid in workforce recruitment and retention efforts?
I agree with what Dr. Hearn said earlier, that what you really want to focus on is effective capacity, that even if you have the buildings, you need the labor there. And so in a way, labor acts as a constraint on capacity. Visa issues, there's a lot of foreign labor that's employed in these plants. So, I think thinking about immigration and visa policies that increase that availability. And then, of course, thinking about opportunities for domestic workers too, whether it's workforce training or what have you, I think are important. And then the other, I think, piece of this is investments in research related automation to make these plants less reliant on labor. So I think, a combination of those are three things that you could think about: immigration issues, training issues for domestic workers, and then investments in research and automation.
Okay, so that was my last question, but in the here and now, have you noticed difference from states to states on labor shortages, where states like Tennessee that dropped the unemployment bonus, the $300 per week unemployment bonus, have you seen an increase in uptick in production in those states that have done that?
Sure. I mean, this is a matter of debate, I think, among some economists, what impact the extra, unemployment benefits and payments that have been associated with the COVID recovery acts have done to our labor force. My view is it probably has some effect. It has had some effect on people's willingness to engage in the labor force. What we do see is in food processing, we've seen some pretty significant increases in wages as well. So it's an attempt by packers to try to pull labor in, but that's fighting against people's other incentives to do different things. So I think it's a difficult balance there. I'm not personally aware of big regional or geographic differences in there, although I'm sure they probably exist.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lusk, and Chairman Costa, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and the chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa, a very significant beef state in this country, Congresswoman Axne. Congresswoman Axne, are you there?
I'm here, Chairman.
The time is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this important hearing, certainly, and the witnesses here for sharing your testimony with us in the committee. We all know that over the last year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated our supply chain issues with the beef industry, and our producers face bottlenecks in processing, price fluctuations, and increased uncertainty. These issues aren't new, and as a result, producers in Iowa are definitely feeling the harmful effects. I've heard time and time again from my constituents something needs to change. So just this month, I was with Secretary Vilsack touring a couple of operations in Southwest Iowa for the Secretary's announcement to expand processing capacity. And we heard directly from producers who told us they recently literally had to sell their cattle at a loss only for the packer to turn around and make a higher profit on it. I know these stories aren't unique. We've all heard them, and I'm sure many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would attest that we need to change that. Obviously, this isn't right. It's not sustainable and something that we need to change. And I'm so glad that Secretary Vilsack is putting funds from the American Rescue Plan towards this issue to help us expand more processing capacity and increase competition in the industry. We need more regional processing, more price discovery, and more competition so our family farmers in Iowa can be profitable and stay in operation. So Dr. Jacobs, first off, always great to see an Iowan. Thank you for being here before the committee and joining us today. I'm particularly interested in the ideas in your testimony to support producer ownership of processing facilities. You gave a couple of examples of smaller scale operations that are producer owned, but noted that there really aren't any large scale facilities that are owned by the producers. So my first question is, you offered a few reasons as to why this might be the case, such as economies of scale, and suggested that USDA reaches minimum efficient scale for processing. Can you elaborate a bit here as to what such a study might look like and what you think they might find?
Thank you for that question. And I can elaborate on what a study might look like. And I think it's important to understand that, I want to clarify as part of my testimony that I wasn't trying to suggest that producer ownership may reach the same capacity as some of the very large processors we have right now, or maybe that's even necessary. But they do need to reach a processing capacity that allows for some profitability in those margins. And I think what's important to note here is that when you have producer ownership in the downstream markets, for example, producer ownership of the packers, the processing, the example you gave where the livestock producer lost money on the sale of cattle to the processor, only for the processor to have a very large margin, all of those, then that value would be aggregated back at the producer. So that does help, solve that, partially mitigate that challenge. I think a study needs to understand, and I know we see a number of plants that have announced coming on board potentially at 500 head per day. Anecdotally, I think that's a number I've heard, and I'm not prepared to testify about the economics of that because I'm not an expert in the livestock economics. But I think something to understand where, on average, margins can be profitable at the processing level. They don't necessarily have to be on the same level of margins as the very large scale processors, but something to understand that is needed. And I think we have the data to do that. And we, through surveys of existing processing and producers and the data we have, I think we can do that.
Just out of curiosity, how long do you think a study like this would take?
How many economists are on it? Sorry, it's flippant. Couple months. I'm not really sure.
Okay, I just want, for curiosity, because as we get moving on this, I want to see what kind of timelines we're looking at. I appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to see if you could expand on in your testimony is how these producer-owned facilities would be more resilient and could navigate some of these supply chain problems that we've talked about today.
I think the resiliency really comes through the coordination that happens between the producers and the part of the supply chain they own. So when you have communication between the producers and the company that they own, you get more information exchange, you get more pricing exchange. It allows producers to be closer to the consumer and closer to the wholesale and the retail markets in that case. And so while we don't have examples, we can't say for sure, for example, that the experience of a producer owned or a cooperative in processing would have been any different in the face of COVID or some of the other shocks that we've had. We do see examples where cooperatives have exemplified more resiliency. And one example of that, for example, is Land O'Lakes during COVID didn't dump a single gallon of milk. Now their situation is different and the shocks to their supply chain were different than what would be facing a processing. But I think because of the communication and because of that that intricate tie between the producers and the processing that could exist, you're going to get more creative solutions, in my opinion.
Well, I appreciate that. And as somebody who spent time talking with the head of CEO of Land O'Lakes and know a little bit about how they operate, I couldn't agree with you more. I think their internal operations help them, create the resiliency that they needed. So thank you so much. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Yes, we thank the gentlewoman. Her time has expired, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman Costa, and thank each of you witnesses for being here and this important testimony. Dr. Lusk, you mentioned immigration. Specifically, what policies or work policies can we implement in that arena to make it better?
Yeah, I can't claim to be an expert on those issues, but from my understanding, numbers of H-2A visas, these sorts of things, the types of workers that would be most likely to work in these processing plants would be a place that I would start looking. But there are probably people more qualified than me to answer that specific question.
Okay, but to make it easier for renewals and to make sure that we can get those folks in here when we need them and to make it easier for them to get here and work, that definitely helps, whether that's electronically or just easing up on the process for green cards.
Indeed.
Okay. And second, for you, what effects did you see in the market as a result of the JBS attacks, and have they been resolved? And if so, how quickly did that occur?
The impacts of the JBS attack were they were a bit confounded with a holiday event, holiday weekend. Many packers will actually, process fewer cattle on holidays to begin with. And this happened to occur at the same time that probably they would have been processing fewer cattle in the first place. So it appears that the market impacts of that were fairly short-lived. Professor derLite can talk about this more than me. My understanding is that JBS had some backup systems, so they were able to get back up and running. And so there are things that I think individual producers can do to make sure that when these things happen, that their effects are indeed short-lived, and that seems to be what happened in this particular case, fortunately.
Okay, and Dr. Hearn, I have a question to you. As you know, U.S. cattle herd cycles through periods of expansion and contraction over the course of several years. During peaks and herd expansion, cattle prices tend to be lower because of the higher availability of supply. Conversely, during the troughs of contraction, cattle prices increase as more packers compete for tighter cattle supplies. And I'm proud that we have our great big meat packers, but I also believe in the diversity and having more smaller sources. So with that in mind, what tools do small beef packers and processors need to remain solvent and successful during the contractions when they're competing with larger farms for finished cattle?
I think number one, they need to be able to identify consumer demand opportunities that they can differentiate their product from just commodity product. I also think they need to be able to coordinate their supply chains, both with cattle producers and with in-product beef consumers. So being able to make sure they can supply the cattle that they need for their operations is critical.
And then finally, Dr. derLite, for you, these cyber attacks are going to continue until we either make the cost high enough for the people that are conducting them, or either we harden ourselves such that it becomes so difficult that it's no longer profitable. With that in mind, what can USDA or we in Congress do that would make it easier for us to defend this cyber attack, especially some of our smaller places, smaller farms or smaller producers that just don't have the basic tools and knowledge in order to prevent a cyber attack or make it difficult?
Thanks. So, as an academic, I'm going to say education, right? So most of the cyber attacks, there's a human element to it. There's a lot that we can do to harden systems, but it's that human machine interface that often presents the openings for these cyber attacks to occur. So education, not only for all of our owners and operators, but also education for specific cybersecurity professionals that really understand the operational environment into these facilities, I think will truly be critical. And to me, USDA and DHS can play a role in that by making really clear, adapting those cybersecurity plans that other critical infrastructures use to make it really super easy and understand into our food and agriculture partners. But it's an education process.
Well, I want to thank all three of you witnesses. I have no doubt with great minds like yours advising this committee and our nation that we will work through all the problems that we have. And thank you very much for your time today. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right, the gentleman yields back his time. We thank him for his questions. And the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Rush, as our next member, and then followed by Congressmember Bacon. Congressman Rush.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very exciting hearing. My question is directed to Dr. derLite. Dr. derLite, I want to thank you for your expert testimony today regarding cyber attacks. This is an issue that I'm extremely concerned about. I am the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Energy and Power, and I have championed solutions to cyber attacks in the energy sector. I believe that this multi-sector problem will also benefit from a broader solution, and that the threat to our food supply chain is really, really troubling to me. In particular, I'm concerned about ransom payments, which you succinctly stated, making it likely that attacks will continue, particularly when paid with cryptocurrency, which of course is hard, if not impossible, for law enforcement to track. In your expert testimony, Dr. derLite, should the government prevent companies from paying a ransom? Why or why not? And secondly, would the same thinking apply to making currencies using cryptocurrency? Why and why not also?
Thank you for those questions. It's tough to say that there's a one policy fits all here. If you think about the attack on JBS, they had encrypted backups and they were able to rebuild their systems and could potentially have done so even without the ransomware payment. But they were concerned about data that could have been stolen that they wanted to be able to recover. But in the most recent Kaseya attack, there are still many in the industry, not just food and ag sector, but also affecting some academic institutions where their data is now completely locked because they don't have an encryption key to recover that. And so you're going to lose multiple years of research effort and initiative. So I think if we go down the path of a policy to say we can't pay ransomware, that's going to be a difficult one to navigate. And then cryptocurrency is also interesting. My personal view is I think cryptocurrency is here to stay. But having our federal authorities, our digital authorities that are working actively, NSA, FBI, those guys, a better understanding of how and monitoring that space and monitoring that electronic space, I think is going to be really critical. And they proved their essentiality by being able to pull back some of the JBS cryptocurrency money. So I think it's going to be a really tough area to navigate, and we should certainly do it in a collaborative public-private fashion.
Thank you. Switching gears, Dr. Lusk, how can Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Jacobs, I want to thank you for your fascinating testimony on the importance of cooperatives. What's the average size of a producer-owned agricultural cooperative? And while I understand that cooperative membership cannot discriminate on the factors of race and other factors, do you know whether African American producers are proportionally represented in the cooperative sector? Are there any barriers that will prevent them from choosing to join a cooperative? And if so, what do we need to do in order to lower those barriers?
Thank you for that question. You asked some insightful ones, and I will say my familiarity in working with agricultural cooperatives is primarily dominated by my experience in the Midwest. I do know that cooperatives exist, and in fact, some of the early historical cooperatives were owned by African Americans in the Southeast. And so while we don't see in my work, I don't see representation, that representation does reflect what we see of the demographics of farmers. It is important to note that cooperatives are voluntary organizations, so voluntary and open membership. And you're right, they should not discriminate on the basis of race or age or religious preferences or along those lines. So there are opportunities, and what I would encourage states to do is look at their cooperative statutes and make sure that they are appropriately structured such that there are no barriers to participation by any race.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that concludes my time. I want to yield back.
Well, thank the gentleman from Illinois. He yields back, and the next member in order is Congressmember Bacon.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all our experts testifying today. This is a very important subject for Nebraska. We're the #1 beef export state in the country, and it's vitally important to our economy. My first question is to Dr. Hearn and Dr. Lusk. You know, the USDA recently announced the availability of $500 million in assistance to help increase and diversify U.S. processing capacity. Do you anticipate they will need to be highly specialized to succeed? And if so, how important might alternative marketing arrangements and specialized formula purchase agreements be to this success? Thank you.
I'll
Dr. Hearn first.
Share my thoughts.
Go ahead.
So, yes, I do believe these new ventures, if they're going to succeed, will need to be specialized. And in terms of AMAs, alternative marketing agreements, I think they are the best way to ensure that these new plants can get the specialized type of cattle in a consistent manner in order to meet the demands of the brand that they are trying to build.
Thank you. Any other input?
One point I would make, and we've talked a lot about producer ownership and cooperatives, and I just want to provide an example that has proven very successful in the beef industry, and currently it's not in the form of a cooperative. And I'll use names, it's all public information, but U.S. Premium Beef is a company that is producer owned, and it's a minority but significant shareholder in National Beef, the 4th largest packer in the U.S. And previously to that, they were majority shareholders in that packing company. So just an example of how producer ownership has been successful in some cases.
I think that's a great example of an alternative marketing arrangement. Are there other examples like that? Thank you.
On that scale, certainly not that I'm aware of, but producer ownership in some plants has been definitely attempted in the past, and a lot of the roadblocks that those types of ventures run into is not clearly identifying how they're going to sell every pound of beef that they have, not just the consumable product, but rendering, but hides, offal. So there's really a lot that needs to be done on the back end of the plant as much as with cattle coming in to ensure that any business is going to be successful.
My next question is for anybody on the entire panel. When I was first elected in 2017 in the 115th Congress, I made the Foot and Mouth Disease Vaccine Bank a top priority to get funded. I think this year we're in the final year of getting it IOC and operational. Could you just talk about maybe the importance of protecting our cattle market, our processors, and this whole industry from foot and mouth disease and the importance of having this vaccine bank. Thank you. I just open it up to anyone who'd like to speak up.
I think we can look at the impacts of some of those animal disease events, whether it's foot and mouth disease or even before that, the mad cow incidents that have extraordinarily negative impacts on the industry. One of the ways that happens is through losing export markets. That's another answer to how some of these, new plants could differentiate themselves is by specializing in products that are demanded by certain foreign customers. I think when you think about risk mitigation, investments in vaccines and understanding the impacts of new emerging diseases, I think is critically important in ensuring the health of the industry.
Well, Mr. Chair, and to the ranking member, I got to tell you, this is a success, I think, out of the committee, getting this foot and mouth disease vaccine bank stood up. I think we're hitting the final year of it becoming IOC, and it's something we can feel proud of that we led in this committee. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And vaccines work, as we all know. We were just commenting on any of us who grew up in agriculture and cattle dairy industry understands the concepts of vaccines and herd immunity and everything else. So, but that's just, as my father used to say, common sense. But then he would pause and say, I'm not sure why they call it common sense. It doesn't seem to be that common. Our next question, I think we have, members, votes have been called. And so it's the chair and the ranking member's intention to continue this going. So I believe there are 3 votes, and we'll just alternate them. And for everybody's understanding, the list that I have here in front of me is on the Republican side, Bear, Mann, Feenstra, Moore, and Rouser. And on the Democratic side, Hayes and Spamberger. Hayes has her camera off, I am told, and Spamberger is voting, so I will defer to Mr. Bear. Mr. Bear, you're next. You're up to bat.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity with the ranking member Johnson and being able to participate in this very important issue of the cattle marketing. And I really appreciate the expertise that we have in the witnesses before us today. Dr. Lusk, I'm going to probably start with you. We appreciate all the work that you and your team do back at Purdue. That's my alma mater. And you provide tremendous information to farmers and ranchers, and as well as many entities within the food supply chain. And you give them the information to make better and more informed decisions. But I'm going to start, in your testimony, you described how a small number of cattle that are sold on the cash basis influence the price of a much larger number of formula price cattle, and how this may not allow the formula price market to truly reflect these market fundamentals. So I think I'm a little reluctant, since the data and some of the decisions we're talking about are based on 2 very volatile years, the fire at Holcomb, Kansas, as well as the pandemic year. So I would appreciate, and we know that the cattle cycle, in order from the time you decide to breed a cow until that finished steer makes it to market, can be 2 or 3 years. So how do you think we can do price discovery, improve the prices for the producers, and yet not lose some of the economies of scale that we have in the current slaughter capacity? So that's my question. Would appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, so first, thanks for your excellent representation in Indiana, Representative Baird, and we're proud to have you as an alumni at Purdue University. I think there are a variety of ways to think about improving price discovery. I think there is some debate about how many transactions one actually needs for good price discovery, and it's not necessarily clear we're at a point where there are too few, but there are certainly some people who would argue that we need more. A couple of ideas have been floated to improve more, increase the amount of information that's in the market. There's some proposals for a market maker program, essentially a mix of assessments and sort of subsidies, incentives for people to trade in the cash market. There have emerged some electronic trading markets. For example, the Fed Cattle Exchange is one that has the ability to bring more transactions in a very transparent way to the market. There's been some proposals floated for a mandate. I think I've, made my view clear that I think that's probably fairly costly, but there could be ways to make such mandates less costly through things like a cap and trade type of program.
So I also noticed that you encouraged maybe one of the things we could do would be to improve consumer demand as well as producer productivity and look for those efficiencies. You care to elaborate on that anymore?
Sure. One of the great things about working at a land-grant university is I get to see all the fantastic work my colleagues are doing at the university. So when I look at my colleagues in the animal science department or the vet med department, they're working all kinds of interesting things like studying, putting wearables on dairy cattle to monitor their movements and using artificial intelligence to get early warning detection of disease. Some of my colleagues are working on biosensors to detect bovine respiratory disease early in an affordable way to do that. Studying heat stress, how you can reduce that heat stress in animals and animal health issues so that we can reduce reliance on antibiotic issues. And we've got a big research program here at Purdue focused on improving animal welfare issues. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on, and some of that is aimed at improving sustainability of the beef supply chain, but hopefully improving and providing a higher quality product to consumers as well.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. Does anyone else care to comment on that, the production efficiency and so on, and maintaining the capacity?
Congressman, I'll add a couple thoughts, and this is more along the lines of price discovery. I think we've seen in other species that we don't always have to discover price solely at the livestock level. There are examples, particularly in swine, where they use meat prices to help determine the price of hogs that are on formula. So I think any mandate that would dictate that we have to price a certain number of cattle off of a cattle cash transaction certainly hinders the ability to adapt to maybe some new opportunities to price cattle off of beef itself sometime down the road.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
This is Dr. Vandelite. I just want to play on Dr. Lusk's comment. All those technologies that he mentioned in his response to the question about improving efficiency, the biosensors and such, those are all operational technology issues that now takes that cyber concern that I have at the packer level all the way down now to the producer level.
Thank you very much, witnesses, and I see my time's up. So with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And to our witnesses, I am filling in for Chairman Costa while he goes to vote. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm excited to be here today to talk about an issue that matters deeply, not just to the many cattle producers across my district, Virginia's 7th district, but to all of us across the country that have come to rely on affordable, high quality, and readily accessible U.S. beef. Across my district, I have heard about how disruptions to our supply chain brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic have threatened the livelihood of livestock producers over the last year. And unfortunately, volatility and uncertainty in the beef and cattle markets are not new. Continued consolidation within the meatpacking and processing industry have resulted in long-term reductions in processing capacity and increased risk from unexpected and unplanned disruptions. This is why I was proud to work with my colleague, Representative Dusty Johnson, to introduce the Butcher Block Act, which would establish a loan program at USDA for new and expanding meat processors, as well as a grant program to help increase hiring and processing capacity at these plants. I've been excited to see USDA take steps with funding provided through the American Rescue Plan to help increase competition for meat and poultry processing, and I believe the Butcher Block Act would help expand these efforts and ensure their longevity. So, Dr. Lusk, I'd like to begin with a question for you. Can you explain or speak to how having increased diversity in the supply chain, such as more small or medium-sized plants, could help reduce the likelihood that a black swan event will have such a large impact on cattle and beef prices?
Well, the hope is that if some future pandemic comes along and it affects the workforce of a plant, that if one goes down, that there is enough heterogeneity, diversity in the system, that the aggregate supply side effects are fairly minimal. I think the challenge, the trade-off that exists there is this issue of economies of scale that's been mentioned, that to really produce beef at an affordable price, you really need to be large, achieve some high level of volume. It's one of the reasons we see the kinds of large-scale packing that we have in this sector. And as a result, if you look at the number of cattle, say, processed by fairly small plants, it's a fairly small share of the overall story. But I think there is value in having some of that heterogeneity and diversity in the system. I think the question is really at what cost will it have to the system? Can they stay in business and compete? I think one issue that I see is related to the cyber attack issue. In some ways, I think the larger plants are more vulnerable to cyber attack because they're a bigger, more lucrative target to seek out. So in some sense, having some smaller, more diversified plants could help in the sense they may be less visible to people seeking to disrupt our food supply chain through that mechanism.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that comment related to potential vulnerabilities to cyber attack. In your opinion, are the recent investments by USDA in small and medium-sized processors enough to mitigate the current issues that we're seeing in cattle and beef markets? And do you believe that Congress should take any additional steps? Or do you have any suggestions that you would want us to be highlighting related to supply chain resiliency?
I think we're already in a process where we're realigning processing capacity with cattle numbers. So my fear, to be honest, is that we may wake up 3 years from now and have a bunch of processors that can't affordably operate. Adding more capacity now will in the short run, I think, help support cattle prices. But I think what we have to hedge against is, not now, but 4 or 5 years from now, when we get those numbers realigned, is, make sure you keep an eye out for what's happening. And are we going to see a series of bankruptcies or, reductions in plant sizes? I think that's my concern with the additions of capacity we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you very much for that. And Dr. Hearn, would you care to comment on that question or add anything to the answer?
Certainly, and in a lot of ways, I would echo what Dr. Lusk mentioned. I've put in my testimony that I think there's opportunity for about 5,000 head of operational capacity. And again, I'm going to highlight that, meaning it not only could come from physical facilities, but could come from improved efficiencies and throughput and better, being able to staff these facilities. I also want to highlight that 5,000 number that I've put out is very contingent on the depth of the contraction in the cow herd. And, the deeper this contraction goes, the smaller that number of profitable expansion is going to get. And so, again, I'll reiterate something I've said all along. I think it's more important to invest in research and education and understanding the business environment than it is specifically in facilities themselves.
Okay, thank you very much for that feedback and for your answer. My time is expired, and I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Connecticut is home to 10 meat processing facilities. All are small to medium sized, mostly family-run facilities. Additionally, we are home to 48 beef cattle producers, according to the State Department of Agriculture. When talking about beef supply chains and processing, Facilities like these are often left out of the conversation. While Congress has appropriated millions to the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program to help producers, including beef cattle producers, only 8.1% of Connecticut farmers were eligible. This is a negligible amount, even when compared to other small northeastern states. These farms and processing facilities also were affected by the adverse conditions of the past year. Our producers also had to adapt to the sudden lack of demand from commercial, institutional, and restaurant purchasing. They also had to address the labor concerns caused by COVID, and they also had to adapt to the dropping demand in exported U.S. meat. So my questions will focus on those small to medium-sized plants that I just mentioned. Dr. Jacobs, during the pandemic, we saw an increase in consumer demand for beef directly from the producer or small local butchers. Are there signs that this opportunity will remain as Americans return to a more normal economic activities? And what technical assistance, workforce development, and other capacity building is required of small to medium-sized producers to ensure they can meet food safety standards, consumer performances, and stay competitive?
Thank you for that question. I think, first of all, I think support for that system needs to recognize that type of small and medium scale processing allows producers to be closer to consumers. And although I don't have the data and can't comment on that, your question about whether or not we've seen consumers return to their pre-pandemic purchasing, the food away from home versus food at home and where they're getting their beef. My suspicion is that we are going to have many consumers will remain purchasing their animal products directly from farmers or small processors. I think part of that will stick. How much of it, I can't comment on that, and I'd be happy to look into that further to see what has remained. But you mentioned what other ways can we support this, and I want to comment too about and introduce this idea of the USDA's efforts to provide funding and capacity. I think what's important here is to do the things that you mentioned, which is instead of necessarily offsetting capacity costs, work on the things that are also cost to the input in beef processing, such as labor development challenges. Also, challenges related to meeting regulations and the differential impacts that may have on small producers and small processors relative to the very large ones. Loan guarantees could be an important part of this overall package. So I think, what I would encourage is to look at the more indirect investments that can benefit our producers, our livestock producers and their processors. I'm glad to hear that there are small local processors that are doing well, and I hope that they continue to. And I might encourage those that are family owned to consider thinking about a model in which they coordinate, in which they consolidate. And maybe there's an opportunity there for joint processing capacity, shared capacity that allows them to scale up.
Thank you. You mentioned it briefly, but can you just touch upon what are the benefits of having more local and regional processing options where they're right next to their consumers?
The benefits are options for consumers. The benefits are flexibility. When you have challenges in larger scale processing, even though as I understand it, our small and medium scale, we don't have enough of those to pick up slack when we have major disruptions at some of our largest processors. That local scale is important to the continuity of our food supply chain locally. It's important to the local rural economies where those farmers are living and the processors are, and they're paying wages and they're paying taxes. And so I think the benefits go well beyond what we see as profitability, quote unquote, profitability margins at those levels. And that's one of the features I love about the cooperative model is that many of those benefits stay local, and those benefits aren't just confined to profitability-based benefits.
Well, my time is almost up, so I won't have time for another question, but I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just said. And I know at least in Connecticut 5, if you go to any restaurant, you go out to dinner, you know that beef is from Connecticut when it is, because it's fresh and people immediately identify the name of the producer that it can be attributed to. Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Costa and Ranking Member Johnson. The consolidation of the cattle industry is one of the most critical issues in my district. I hear about this all the time, probably the most important issue in my district at this point. Cattle producers in my district are angry, and they're worried that they are getting a raw deal. They see everyone in the supply chain making large profits while they're losing from $100 to $150 a head. My in-laws, my friends, my constituents are seeing their livelihood end because of this. The processing of cattle is mostly operated by 4 packers, and they control approximately 80% of the market. This market share lets them control the price through contracts, manage the amount being slaughtered through line speeds, and decide when livestock is needed for their own profitable benefits. The system is set up where the packers will very rarely ever see a loss, creating a massive guaranteed profit while rural farmers are on the hook to lose lots and actually their livelihood. Congress needs to engage in this and focus on transparency and competition and processing capacity. The cash market for live cattle has been declining over the last decade. At the same time, we see higher grocery prices and even higher demand. Diminished cash market participation contributes to USDA being unable to publish LMR reports, furthering the market's lack of transparency. So this is my question. My question is for Mr. Lusk. In 2005, 52% of the cattle were purchased on the cash market. In 2020, that has gone down to 23%. The reverse was true as well. In 2005, 33% of the cattle were purchased through formula contracts, yet in 2020, 62% are on formula contract. Knowing that the cash market price is primarily used on the basis for formula pricing, how has the decrease in cash negotiated trade impacted the market and price discovery?
Yeah, I think it's important to, again, distinguish between when you're talking about price discovery, about price levels and then sort of market fundamentals. And I think the concern with the smaller share of cattle being sold in the cash market is whether you're getting sufficient price discovery. But even if 100% of cattle were being sold in a cash market, it doesn't mean prices would have been any higher than what we recently observed. So I think, I think in regards to LMR, there are things that could be done to increase the amount of information that's being conveyed through there, thinking about confidentiality rules, about some of the additional details that could be provided about formula contracts, those sorts of things to provide even more price transparency. I think even doing that, there's not necessarily any guarantee that's going to improve the price level, which is, I think a separate issue.
Well, I'm glad you said that, smaller farms, you probably don't realize this, but there are 700,000 farms in the country. 90% of them are family owned. My in-laws are one of them, own 1,000, 2,000 head of cattle. My friends own, 2,000, 3,000 head of cattle, and they're considered small farms. The problem is when you have large operations having 30 or 40,000 head, it shuts out people like my in-laws and my friends and my family, all right, because they're going through a cash basis and not formula contracting. That's why people get a little grumpy. So my other question is, many proposals before Congress aim to increase price transparency in the cattle market. Cattle producers, just like any other business owner, would like to receive higher prices for their product. What is your assessment on requiring certain levels of negotiated transaction to improve producers' bottom line, Mr. Lusk?
Sure. To be honest, I don't necessarily anticipate that policy as improving overall price levels. I think there could be some benefits in some of those policies improving, price discovery, but I don't necessarily think we could expect those policies to improve the price that cattle producers are getting paid today.
Well, thanks for your comments. And this is a great concern because we're going to lose thousands and thousands of family farms that are doing this, that are getting bullied out, pushed out by packers and formulated contracts. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Mann of Kansas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairman Costa and Ranking Member Johnson, for having this important hearing today. This is crucial to the ag industry as we know it. I'm glad that we're doing this subcommittee hearing. Frankly, I'd like to see this be a full committee hearing because I'm hard-pressed to think of any issue facing agriculture in America today that's more important than what we're seeing in the cattle markets and the importance of the beef industry specifically to American agriculture. It's also very important in my district. I represent the Big First, the largest beef-producing district in the country. Our family's farmed and fed cattle for 120 years. I grew up in a small feed yard, preconditioning and doctoring sick calves. So this is near and dear to my heart personally as well. I'm also a proud K-Stater, and I'm really glad to see a lot of K-Staters here as well. And a lot of concerns about what we've seen over the last 20 months. My first question would really be to both Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Lusk. Congress and the USDA have allocated hundreds of millions in funding towards additional slaughter capacity to help small and medium meat and poultry processors over the last couple of years. Obviously, an announcement more recently as well. There's currently a shortage of shackle space, but as many of you have mentioned, that the cattle industry, like any business, is still subject to the basic economics of supply and demand. So my question really is this: how do we ensure that taxpayer dollars create the maximum shackle space possible? In other words, how do we spend these dollars the most efficiently to move the needle, so to speak? And Dr. Lusk and Jacobs, if you're Dr. Jacobs first, and then maybe Dr. Lusk, if you'd weigh in on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. These investments, I think what I would say is that I think these investments should perhaps think about focusing more on the indirect investments. So direct investment in shackle space, unless we know, for example, that gets these processors, these small and medium, to a point where they can be profitable on their own without the support and without the subsidization, I would question that. And that's why I think a study is needed to understand what are the minimum capacity requirements to get these processors, get small and medium scale. In other words, what is medium scale? What gets them to a minimum efficient scale where they can be profitable apart from subsidization? I do support the indirect investments in things like workforce development, ensuring we have the right policies in place, making sure that the playing field is leveled in terms of regulatory burden and regulatory requirements. But short of that, investments in shackle space are one time. It's a one-time shot in the arm. And I would want to make sure that could be sustainable beyond any investment period.
Great. Thank you. Anything to add to that or any different perspective, Dr. Lusk?
Yeah, well, first, I appreciate the question to think about using taxpayer dollars wisely and efficiently. And I would agree with Dr. Jacobs. And the things that really come to mind is what do you do to increase the size of the pie to improve that overall demand? So some of it is market access issues. Increase that size of the pie by having access to more consumers in different parts of the world, or to improve quality and improve what consumers are willing to pay. That has a longer run benefit for the entire supply chain. And the other aspect too, I think, is innovation, productivity, improving innovation. Some of that we've talked about, the labor issues. That's a way to improve capacity. And effective capacity is maybe some automation there, but also just efficiency. And I think there's, again, beef cattle is in competition with a variety of other foodstuffs, and we're in competition with producers all across the world for a place on consumers' dinner plates. And so we have to continue to find ways to be more efficient and make responsible use of our natural resources.
Yep, I agree. My last question would be for Dr. Hearn. Your testimony suggested that there is an exceptionally high likelihood that cow-calf producers would receive a lower price for their cattle if government mandates if the government would mandate certain required percentages of negotiated cash sales. Could you explain that more, and why do you believe that to be the case?
Certainly. So I think the first step is understanding the benefits that AMAs bring to the marketplace. As I've mentioned both in the testimony and in the earlier question, AMAs allow packers and cattle feeders to both reduce their supply chain risks, better manage inventory, better utilize their cattle feeding and cattle processing capacity, and reduce their marketing and procurement costs. Both of those sectors of the beef industry are margin operators. So the price that they're willing to pay for the upstream input into their production system is very much determined by what their operating costs are. If we increase operating costs at the packer level, packers are likely to pay less for fat cattle. If we reduce the price of fat cattle and increase the operating costs of feedlots, then they are likely to pay less for calves and feeder cattle. So I readily admit that price discovery is necessary, but we have to recognize that it does have a cost, and if we eliminate or reduce the benefits of AMAs, that also has a cost. And with cow-calf producers being primary producers and not margin operators, they have no one else to pass on the burden of that cost.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all. I see my time has expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. But before we adjourn today, I invite the ranking member to share any closing comments that he may have.
Well, I think this has been remarkable, and I just want to focus on three things quickly. First off, there are hopeful signs in this market. We have future prices trending up, but even more importantly than that, longer term, we have all kinds of macro factors that will contribute to upward pressure on price for producers and should exert some downward pressure on price for consumers. And I think to the extent that we can get that done in a sustainable way, that could be tremendously good news. Second thing I want to point out is the reason that this hearing has been so remarkable, and the acting chair and I were just talking about this. There has been a tremendous amount of bipartisanship. There is a legitimate search for policy solutions rather than just the two sides throwing bumper sticker slogans at one another. There has been a real passion. So many of these members have real life experience with these issues. And then finally, there's also real knowledge. I mean, Congress works best when members wade into areas that they understand and that they have taken the time to fully comprehend. And so I would just close, Madam Chair, by saying this. Not only are the signs hopeful, not only has this been a great hearing, but to the extent that we can continue those four major concepts of bipartisanship, search for truth, passion, and knowledge, I think the outlook is even going to be better yet for cattle producers and for consumers, and that's awfully good news in my mind. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. And at this time, votes have been called, and at this time, the subcommittee will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Well, clearly, the talented group of members of this subcommittee have done well without me, and I thank them. Are there any further questions? Okay, shoot, I had one more question I wanted to ask. Actually, I think I see the witness I wanted to ask this to. Dr. Jacobs, are you there?
I am.
Question, and I was going over this with my colleague here from North Dakota. The landscape for over 100 years in American agriculture has seen the success in co-ops in a whole host of regions in different areas. But it doesn't seem to me that co-ops have really established themselves within the beef industry, the cattle industry. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that based upon your own experience and research with co-ops, why that has not been the case and whether you think that's consistent or not.
That's a great question. That is something that I've spoken with colleagues about. And you're right. If you look across many of the sectors within ag, dairy, fruit, nuts, the list goes on, juices, we do see farmer-owned cooperatives playing major parts in those landscapes, grain marketing included. And
Throughout
we do have
California.
a couple examples like Country National Beef, Grassroots Farmers Co-op, and Buckeye Valley. These aren't large-scale cooperatives. And the question you ask is a good one, like why don't we see producer ownership along the supply chain, further along the supply chain in a major way in beef? And I think the answer comes down to the enormous capital investment it requires. That's what I come back to. And over time, the landscape has changed such that, and there's been concentration such that producers who try to form now are really starting a foot race much later in the game. And so that is the only explanation I would have for that. I'm sure there are other reasons, but I think they, that concentration happened early and for factors that I'm not prepared to talk about or an expert to talk about. But I think it has a lot to do with the enormous capital that's required in this industry.
Well, thank you. All of our time's expired, and I think we've had an excellent panel of witnesses this morning, and we thank you for your time and your effort. I want to thank the ranking member, gentleman from North Dakota, my friend, and we're going to continue to work together with this subcommittee over the course of this session and the rest of this year to make sure that our efforts are productive and reflective of the needs of the livestock needs throughout our country and also dealing with issues of foreign agriculture. So thank you all. I want to say that, frankly, the beef supply chain is heavily dependent upon having an important processing capacity to operate efficiently. We've talked about that this morning. Innovative ways to protect and adapt the supply chain to new realities. We've talked about that. I farm in the Fresno, California area, but I don't farm the way my father did, nor my grandfather. I think that the innovation that we see in American agriculture for over 245 years is a great part of its success. There will be externalities such as wildfires or droughts like we're facing in the West. In California, 50 of the state's 58 counties are under drought emergency. But disasters, we know, are frequent, whether they be floods along the Mississippi River or whether hurricanes in the South. And clearly, with climate change, these factors, these weather factors, I think are more constant, and we have to look at how we provide a resilient supply chain and sufficient processing capacity to factor in. So there's a lot of things we got to do. We got to consider. The ranking member and I have talked about ways in which we can work smarter and strategically that will enable us to foster a more shock resilient supply chains, because as we learned in this pandemic, you turn that supply chain upside down and it has significant ramifications, and also more volatility in the marketplace. and that doesn't help anybody. Consumers who are all Americans and our producers. So the chair will adjourn the subcommittee under the rules. Record today's hearing will remain open. The record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days. To receive any additional material and supplementary written responses from witnesses to any question posed by a member. That is an opportunity for all members of the subcommittee. So this hearing of the Subcommittee of Livestock and Foreign Agriculture is adjourned, and I want to thank the staff on the majority and the minority side for making a very productive subcommittee hearing. Thank you very much.